I hadn't planned to attend the family dinner that night. I told Camille as much 3 days before, when she handed me the embossed menu card with a look that was more obligation than invitation. "It's just dinner," she said, brushing lint from her blazer, not even looking at me. But that's the problem. Nothing was ever just anything with her family. A simple dinner meant a gauntlet of veiled insults, sideways glances, and polite laughter that felt like it had been pre-recorded. I'd endured it for years, smiling through it all, like some accessory she wore when it served her. But this time was different, because I paid for the dinner. Orello's wasn't the kind of place you stumbled into with coupons or birthday rewards. It was high-end, exclusive, and every inch of its private dining suite whispered old money and polished secrets. I'd reserved it weeks in advance, not because I was feeling generous, but because part of me wanted to see them squirm. That silent, bitter curiosity in me wanted to know how they'd act when I showed up. Not begging, not trying, just there, present and unbothered. Camille had asked me to dress well, for appearances. I wore the navy suit she once said made me look too serious. Perfect. The doorman greeted me like I belonged, like he didn't know what kind of war I was walking into, and I appreciated that. The air inside was heavy with truffle oil, aged wine, and tension. They were already seated when I arrived. Camille, her father Raymond at the head of the table, her mother Lena across from him, and her sister Elise with that smug little smirk she wore like perfume. I took the empty seat next to Camille without asking. No one acknowledged me at first. Not really. Her mother gave a thin smile. Elise scrolled her phone like I hadn't just walked in. Raymond didn't even blink. I poured myself water, calmly, like I wasn't a ghost in their little curated dinner scene. "You're late," Camille muttered under her breath, eyes forward. "And overdressed." "I paid," I replied, equally quiet. Figured I'd get my money's worth. Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing else. The waiter brought appetizers, scallops with caviar on gold-rimmed plates, and they all acted like nothing was wrong. Elise talked about her influencer deal. Lena raved about the new wine club they joined. Raymond criticized a senator like he'd played poker with him the night before. It was all so performative. I could have sworn someone had cued the lines. I chewed my food slowly, responding when necessary, but mostly I just watched, observed. Camille laughed at her father's jokes, leaned into the role of perfect daughter. I remember when that smile used to be reserved for me, before status and optics swallowed whatever was left of us. The wine flowed faster than the conversation, and I began to notice the flickers. Tight glances between Camille and Elise, the way Lena seemed more tense than usual. Something was coming. I didn't know what, not yet, but the undercurrent was there. It always is, right before a wave crashes. "How's work?" Elise asked, eyes gleaming, fork poised delicately. "You still doing that business consulting thing?" "That thing just funded this dinner," I said smoothly. "But yes, still doing quite well." "Oh," she said, tone dipped in sarcasm. "Nice to hear. I just thought maybe you'd moved on to something more stable." Camille chuckled softly. I looked directly at Elise and smiled. Stability is overrated. Leverage, though, that lasts. Her expression faltered for a second, just long enough to satisfy something small and spiteful in me. Raymond finally looked my way, only to reach for the wine. "As long as you're not using Camille's money for these little business ventures of yours," he said, almost casually. Camille didn't defend me. "Of course not. That would have been too much like partnership." "Of course not," I said. "I've got my own portfolio. You'd be surprised how profitable it is not to rely on handouts." Raymond grunted, uninterested in my financial independence. Camille turned toward me, face pleasant, voice low. "Just don't make a scene tonight, okay? It's important." "To who?" I asked. "Them or you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she picked up her wine glass, glanced at the others, then checked her reflection in the back of her spoon. I watched her, and for a moment, I didn't recognize the woman beside me. Somewhere along the line, Camille stopped being mine. And maybe I'd stop being hers too. But there was no sadness in that realization. Only clarity. I leaned back, letting the sound of cutlery and fake laughter fill the space. I had thought seeing their faces when I arrived would bring satisfaction. But it didn't. It felt quiet, like standing in a room that used to echo with your voice, but now held only dust and shadows. Still, I was here. I was part of the play, at least for now. And if I had to endure one more cold, calculated evening with this family, I'd do it my way, on my terms. I signaled for the waiter, asked for another glass of Malbec, and let the next course arrive. It would be the last dinner I attended like this. Because whether they knew it yet or not, everything was about to change. I didn't know what Camille had planned, but I knew what I was prepared to do. And this time, I wouldn't be eating what they served. I'd be serving something of my own. Cold, precise, and unforgettable. We were halfway through the main course, veal medallions and a truffle reduction, when Camille tapped her wine glass with the edge of her butter knife. The clear, chiming ring echoed through the private suite like a signal, drawing every eye to her. I set my fork down slowly, dabbing the corner of my mouth with a cloth napkin, already knowing whatever was coming wasn't a toast or a thank you. Camille stood, her posture perfect, her voice a soft per-coated and expensive charm. "Everyone," she began, holding her glass just high enough to command attention. "Thank you for being here tonight. I know it's not often we all manage to gather like this." She smiled toward her father, then to her mother, then Elise. Finally, she turned slightly toward me, and I felt the chill of that smile without warmth. "I just wanted to share some personal news before dessert." Her mother straightened slightly, anticipating some curated triumph, maybe a pregnancy announcement or a magazine feature. Elise crossed her legs and smirked like she was in on it. Raymond kept chewing, uninterested until dollars or his reputation were mentioned. "Harlan and I are getting a divorce," Camille said, her voice like silk wrapped around a scalpel. The fork in my hand didn't slip. My glass didn't tremble. I simply looked at her and blinked once, slowly, like I was watching a commercial for a product I didn't want to buy. Around the table, reactions sparked like matches. Lena gasped, hand flying to her necklace. Elise exhaled like she'd been holding the punchline of a joke too long. Raymond looked up at me, then at Camille, and nodded once, as if he already knew and approved. That expression, that satisfaction on his face, told me more than words ever could. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't some mutual agreement born of midnight conversations and quiet regret. No, this was staged. Camille sat down slowly, as if expecting applause. Or maybe tears. Or a meltdown. But I didn't give her any of that. I reached for my glass, an 08 Bordeaux I'd chosen myself, and took a calm sip. The wine was excellent. Rich. Bold. The kind that lingered on your tongue. I set it down without rush and stood. Every eye turned toward me, now unsure, now curious. Camille raised an eyebrow like she was waiting for me to embarrass myself. But I just smiled. "Funny you mention news," I said, voice smooth, steady. "I have some of my own." Camille's smirk faltered for the briefest moment. That flicker of confusion was a gift. The table tensed again, like the moment before thunder. "I wasn't planning on saying anything tonight," I continued, my gaze brushing over each of them. "But since we're being transparent," I turned slightly, hands folded in front of me like I was about to deliver a keynote. Elise leaned forward, eager. "What is it? Did you finally land that? Whatever it is you do?" I chuckled softly, not breaking eye contact with her. "Not quite. But I did close a rather important deal last week. Something significant." Raymond raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. His knife scraped against his plate as he cut into the veal again. But I saw it. The pause in motion, the way his hand tightened ever so slightly. Camille folded her arms, the corners of her mouth twitching. She thought I was bluffing. I let the silence stretch, savoring it. "I've acquired controlling interest," I said, each word deliberate, "in Dufresne Group International." The silence cracked like a whip. Raymond's fork clattered against his plate and dropped with a dull metallic sound. Camille blinked, once, twice. Her lips parted, then closed again, like she was trying to reboot mid-sentence. "That's," Elise started, then stopped. She didn't know what Dufresne Group meant. But Raymond did. Lena did. Camille should have. "Your little consulting firm acquired shares?" Camille asked, voice sharp now, stripped of its earlier charm. "Is this another one of your side projects, Harlan?" "No," I said simply. "It's not a side project. It's the culmination of 15 months of strategic acquisition, leverage buyouts, and shareholder negotiations. And as of last Friday, I hold the majority stake." Raymond leaned back in his chair, his jaw set. "You're lying." I looked him dead in the eye. "I'm not." Lena clutched her pearls, literally, as if the weight of that gesture would somehow protect her from what I just said. Elise looked between us, catching up, realizing this wasn't just a business deal. It was a strike. Camille, though, she wasn't done. She never was. "That's impossible," she said, shaking her head. "Daddy would never sell." He built that company. I didn't sell, Raymond said, his voice low and bitter. Your Uncle Morris did, along with Victor and Elise's holdings. Apparently, they were eager to cash out. Camille looked at him like he'd just slapped her. They, what? They were tired of being frozen out, I added, my voice calm. And tired of watching their equity shrink under your father's iron grip. Elise stood now, clearly offended. I didn't sell anything. I smiled politely. Not you, Elise Dufresne. The other Elise. Your cousin. From the Geneva branch. Oh, she muttered, deflating slightly. Camille turned back to me, her voice shaking now. So what? You own some shares? Big deal. That doesn't mean anything. You're not one of us. No, I agreed. I'm not. And that's exactly why it worked. Raymond slammed his napkin onto the table. You conniving. I raised a hand, not to silence him, but to hold the floor. All I did was recognize an opportunity. Your family's internal grudges were more valuable than any loan I could have taken out. I offered them dignity and a premium payout, and they took it. Camille stared at me like she didn't recognize the man she married. Maybe she didn't. Maybe she never bothered to try. But I saw it in her eyes now, that unraveling. The calculation racing behind her gaze. The moment where control slipped from her hands like a champagne glass off a polished table. And, I added, glancing toward Raymond, there's one more piece of news. But I'll save that for dessert. I sat back down. Slowly, calmly. The room didn't buzz. It hummed with unease. I lifted my glass again, let the wine touch my lips, and waited. Camille didn't smile this time. She didn't speak. She simply stared at me across the table she thought she controlled, and for the first time since I met her, she looked genuinely unsure of what came next. I didn't rush. I let them sit with it, the weight of my words, the ripples crashing through their curated reality. Elise picked at her plate now, appetite evaporated. Lena was whispering something sharp and anxious into her wine. And Raymond? He hadn't touched his food since the last thing I said. His eyes stayed on me, narrow and fixed, like he was trying to unspool how I'd managed it. Camille sat stiffly beside me, arms crossed, breathing shallow. I could feel her fury tightening in her posture. But she wouldn't show it. Not here. Not until she had something to spin the moment back in her favor. She always needed control. Unfortunately for her, I'd spent too long learning from that. When I cleared my throat, they all looked up again, the tension so thick you could have sliced it and sold it as a side dish. You're all probably wondering how. I began, letting my fingers trail around the stem of my wine glass. How someone like me pulled this off. Camille scoffed, but it was weaker than her usual jabs. Harlan, is this another one of your little business projects? She asked, using the same mocking tone she'd used on me for years. The one that said you're beneath us, even while smiling for family photos. I turned toward her slowly. No, Camille, I said gently. This wasn't a passion project. This was chess. Elise frowned. You mean like a metaphor, or you actually play? It's a metaphor. Raymond snapped. Thank you, I said dryly. Look, I know how it sounds. The consultant's son-in-law, the outsider, buying up pieces of the family empire. But that's the thing, you only ever saw me as that. A background accessory. An extension of Camille's image. Camille muttered, Oh, here we go. You never asked what I did after hours, I continued. You didn't ask who I worked with, who I advised, or where I reinvested. You assumed, always, that I was dabbling. I paused, locking eyes with Raymond. But I don't dabble. I build. Raymond pushed his plate forward. If this is your moment, say what you came to say and stop the theatrics. I leaned in slightly. Fine. I'll give it to you straight. I started working with Dufresne Group clients about 4 years ago, quietly. A few mid-level businesses who were tired of the bureaucracy and stagnation. They needed solutions. I gave them results. Word spread. Consulting isn't the same as ownership, Raymond said flatly. You're right, I nodded. Which is why I never settled for just consulting. I started reinvesting what I earned. Small shares in partner companies. I bought debt, secured liens, mapped out the soft underbelly of the empire your father built. All while attending dinners like this and smiling through your barbs. Camille shifted beside me. If you really did this, you had to work with someone inside. There's no way you convince those shareholders without help. Oh, I had help, I said. Just not from the people you think. See, while you were planning spa weekends and Elise was trying to become the face of mineral water, I was having coffee with your Uncle Morris every other Tuesday. Raymond's jaw clenched. He was bitter. He didn't have the stomach for real business. True, I said, but he had enough shares and just enough resentment to listen. And after a few conversations, he agreed to a discreet transfer of voting rights. From there, it was a chain reaction. Victor was looking to retire to Italy. Elise, the Geneva one, wanted out after the last quarterly disaster. That was temporary. Raymond snapped. Not to them, I said. To them, it was a wake-up call. One that made my offer all the more appealing. Above market. Fast exit. Zero drama. Lena looked between us like she'd entered a dream halfway through and couldn't find the plot. But what would you even want with the company? You're not family. Exactly, I replied. I don't owe anyone here loyalty out of blood. Which means I can run the company cleanly, efficiently, and without favoritism. No backroom deals, no last name privileges. Just results. Camille looked like she wanted to stand again, to reclaim the spotlight. You're bluffing. Even if you have shares, you can't do anything with them unless I have controlling interest, I interrupted. Which I do. Raymond narrowed his eyes. You expect us to believe you hold over 51%? Raymond, I said with a smile, I don't expect anything. I have the documents. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out a slim envelope. Camille's eyes followed it like it was a gun. I placed it gently on the table beside my plate. That, I said, is a summary of holdings, notarized, with full transfer authorizations from every shareholder who sold to me. You're welcome to have your lawyers verify it. In fact, I encourage it. Raymond's fingers twitched like he wanted to snatch it, tear it apart, but he didn't move. Instead, he leaned back slowly, like someone trying not to show they'd been punched in the gut. I don't understand, Lena whispered. How could this happen? Because none of you were looking, I said. You were too busy maintaining the illusion of dominance. Too wrapped in your hierarchy to notice who was in the room. I was never trying to impress you. I was watching, listening. And when the moment came, I moved. Camille's voice came soft, almost inaudible. You married me to get to my family. I turned to her, not angry, not smug, just honest. No, Camille, I married you because I loved you, despite your family, despite all of this. But along the way, I realized love doesn't survive in a place where respect is constantly withheld. She blinked, stunned silent for once. I built a life hoping to be seen, I continued, to be accepted. And when that didn't happen, I stopped needing your validation. I started building something else. Something bigger. Raymond finally spoke again, his voice quieter now. You've set fire to years of tradition. You've dismantled a legacy. No, I said. I've saved it. From you. From decay. From the entitlement that was bleeding it dry. No one responded. The room sat steeped in silence, thick and uncomfortable. I finished the last sip of wine in my glass, savoring it. Then, as the waiter arrived to clear the plates, I smiled politely and said, Dessert, anyone? I believe the tiramisu is quite good tonight. I didn't expect them to recover quickly from the last course. They were still chewing on my words more than the food they had pushed around their plates. Camille hadn't spoken since her half-whispered accusation, You married me to get to my family, and now sat like a mannequin, eyes locked somewhere beyond the table. Her posture was stiff, her breathing shallow. Raymond had grown quiet too, which worried me more than his shouting would have. It meant he was calculating, processing, looking for a crack in my story or a way to undo what had already been done. Lena kept shifting in her seat like she couldn't get comfortable in her own skin. And Elise? She was just now realizing this wasn't the kind of family drama that could be reshared as gossip over lunch. This was something else. Something permanent. I waited until the dessert menus were passed around, not that anyone opened theirs, before I picked up where I left off. Not because I needed to prove anything more, but because the full truth deserved to be said aloud, especially after so many years of them pretending I didn't matter. I imagine you have questions, I said, voice low but clear. So let me give you the full picture. Camille didn't flinch. Raymond grunted. No one said no. It started a year and a half ago, I said, at the spring charity auction. Raymond, you pulled me aside and said, maybe next year, let the Real donors handle the heavy lifting. You were half joking, but not really. And I smiled, as usual, and didn't say anything back. But that was the moment I decided I wouldn't keep shrinking to fit in this room. Raymond stared at me like he didn't remember it, but he did. I saw it in the way his brow twitched. I began researching the company's structure that very week. Not out of spite at first, just curiosity. But what I found was a system tangled in old grudges, favoritism, and decaying leadership. Dufresne Group International had the bones of a titan and the stomach of a scandal. Elise finally found her voice. So you thought you should be the one to fix it? I didn't think, Elise. I knew, I replied, because I was already doing it, quietly. The subsidiaries I advised turned profits. Efficiency soared. Clients trusted me because I didn't walk in expecting loyalty. I earned it. So I kept going. I approached cousins you hadn't spoken to in years. I learned who wanted out, who was tired, who felt ignored. And I gave them an option. Camille finally looked at me, eyes wide and uncertain. You did all this behind my back. No, Camille, I said. I did it beside you. While you were there. While you were planning dinners and wine tastings and spa retreats with the same family that treated me like a decorative afterthought. You just didn't ask what I was working on. You never asked. I was busy, she said bitterly. So was I. I reached into my inner jacket pocket again and pulled out a second folder, this one thicker. Camille eyed it like it might bite her. I laid it flat on the table, then opened it. This, I said, tapping the first page, is the timeline of acquisitions. Every meeting, every offer, every legally binding agreement, signed and notarized. The lawyers dotted every I and crossed every T. Morris signed first, then Victor. Geneva Elise followed. After a short bidding war I was happy to let her win, only to offer her more 3 weeks later. By the time the ink dried, I had a clear pathway to voting majority. Raymond leaned forward slightly. So why now? Why reveal it here? At dinner. Because you were never going to give me a seat at your table, Raymond, I said, my voice unwavering. So I built one, and now I own yours. The silence was a thick, tense thing. I walked into the Dufresne boardroom last week. I went on, and the legal team greeted me by name. They had the contracts ready. They verified the holdings. And when I slid the final signed agreement across the table, they said one sentence I'll never forget. Congratulations, Mr. Drake. You're the majority shareholder. Lena covered her mouth. Camille shook her head, still hoping this was some elaborate joke. But Daddy didn't sell. I turned to Raymond. She's right, I said. You didn't. But your pride is what let me buy everything else. You pushed your family so far to the margins they had nothing left to lose. All I had to do was offer them a better deal. And I did. Raymond's face tightened into something jagged. You think this makes you powerful? No, I said. It makes me responsible. Because you built something meaningful once, back when this company stood for something besides legacy and arrogance. Now I get to decide whether it survives the next 50 years. He didn't say another word. His hands, once steady, gripped the arms of his chair. Elise was texting someone under the table now, probably trying to alert whichever remaining cousins hadn't gotten the news. Camille just stared at me. You really hate us that much? I sighed and turned toward her fully. No, I don't hate you. I hate what you became. I hate that you watched me be dismissed, diminished, and excluded and said nothing. I hate that you used me when it was convenient, then forgot me when it wasn't. But most of all, I hate that you thought I'd never see through it. She looked away. I didn't want revenge, I said softly. I wanted respect. When that didn't come, I made a plan. And unlike the chaos your family hides behind, I executed that plan without fanfare or cruelty. Just focus. The server arrived to clear the dishes, unsure whether to interrupt. Raymond waved him off like swatting a fly. Camille sat there motionless, her hands clenched in her lap. I knew the next move would come soon, the panic, the schemes. That was always how they played it. But I was ready. I slid the folder back into my coat and stood. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness, I said, letting my gaze sweep the table one last time. I'm here to inform you, your era is over. The board will be informed officially in 2 days. Transition begins Monday. Your names will be removed from every committee. Camille, you'll receive a detailed summary of marital asset divisions by the end of the week. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. I'm not here to destroy what you built, I said to Raymond. I'm here to clean up what you let rot. And with that, I turned toward the waiter standing near the door and nodded. Dessert's on the way, I said quietly. But I think we've all lost our appetite. I hadn't planned on pulling the document out that early. The one tucked into the inner lining of my jacket, pressed so perfectly between my wallet and my silence. But when Camille tried to downplay it, when she leaned forward and with that old, Smug sharpness in her voice said, "Fine. So you own part of it. That doesn't mean anything. I knew it was time." The room had already gone quiet, but now the air turned surgical. Still, clean in the wrong kind of way. Like the pause before an operation begins. I reached into my jacket with the same calmness I'd practiced for weeks, fingertips brushing against the embossed envelope that held the final nail. Her father's signature. "This," I said, drawing it out like it was a magician's final flourish, "is the letter of retirement Raymond signed this morning." There was a beat. Just 1 second of silence. Then, "You said it was a placeholder." Raymond barked, voice cracking with the panic of a man who just realized he'd been outmaneuvered on the very chessboard he thought he controlled. Camille twisted in her chair, her head snapping toward him. "What?" she hissed. "You what?" Raymond's eyes darted between us, his composure unraveling like cheap thread. He said it was a draft, a symbolic document. I didn't authorize anything official. I stepped forward just slightly, setting the document on the table. I had the company's legal team review it. "You signed under full advisory. There was a notary present. You initialed every clause." Raymond's face drained of color. "You tricked me." "No," I replied evenly. "You underestimated me. You assumed I'd never be anything more than your daughter's quiet accessory. The man who never spoke up at family functions, who let the insults slide, who nodded and smiled and showed up with flowers. You were half right. I was quiet, patient, but I've never been blind." Elise muttered, "Oh my God," under her breath, while Lena covered her mouth again as though the scandal might crawl out of her lips if she didn't keep them sealed. Camille stared at the document like it might vanish if she looked hard enough. I kept speaking. "Effective next month, I will be CEO of Dufresne Group International. That title comes with full executive authority and, unfortunately for you all, full discretion." Raymond tried to straighten up, but the fight was draining from him. "This board won't allow it." I raised my eyebrows. "Which board?" "The one I dissolved 2 days ago with majority shareholder consent. That board." The room went still again. Camille shook her head slowly, like it was all finally sinking in, like she was watching a dam break and realizing she was on the wrong side of the flood. "You can't do that," she said, voice hollow now. "You're not a Dufresne. You don't understand what that company means." I nodded slightly. "You're right. I'm not a Dufresne. That name doesn't mean prestige to me. It means exclusion, arrogance, self-sabotage cloaked in tradition. But I do understand what it could be, what it should be, and I intend to rebuild it." Camille's voice sharpened suddenly. "You don't have the right. My family built that company from nothing." I turned to face her fully. "And I rebuilt it while you were busy planning a dramatic dinner speech. You blindsided me with divorce," I answered with a legacy rewrite. That was it. The final strike. Camille opened her mouth to speak, to argue, but nothing came out. Just a faint breath and the crumbling of her expression. Elise stared at her plate, silent now. Lena looked as though she might cry, though I didn't know if it was for the loss of power, dignity, or her husband's failure. Raymond? He looked at me with the weary resentment of a man who saw his dynasty fall not with an explosion, but with a signature. Camille reached for her wine glass, but missed it slightly, her hand trembling just enough to betray her. "So that's it?" she whispered. "You're just going to erase us?" "No," I said, my voice soft but firm. "You erased yourselves the moment you decided I didn't count. When you laughed behind doors I paid to open. When you chose pride over partnership, cruelty over character. I'm not erasing you. I'm just not saving you." For years I had sat at their tables, spoken in careful tones, worn clothes tailored to fit their expectations. I had played the supporting role in their drama, hoping one day to be accepted into the cast. But this wasn't a performance anymore. This was real. And for the first time, I was the one holding the script. Raymond leaned forward again, trying to sound strong. "You think shareholders and legal tricks make you a leader?" "No," I said. "But foresight, resilience, and knowing exactly when to stop waiting for permission? That does." There was no recovery coming. No sudden reversal. No grandfather clause or golden parachute. Camille knew it. Raymond knew it. And they hated that I didn't gloat. That I wasn't raising my voice or slamming fists or even smiling smugly. I was calm. Grounded. Done. I picked up the letter and slid it back into my jacket. I hadn't brought it to flaunt it. I brought it to remind them this wasn't speculation. It was sealed. Signed. Decided. Camille sat back in her chair, blinking slowly like she was trying to wake from a dream. You planned all this. Down to the last course, I said, echoing her mother's earlier whisper like a final punctuation. I looked around the table one last time, memorizing the faces of the people who had spent years trying to carve pieces out of me like I was a roast they never paid for. I thought I'd feel vindicated, triumphant, but mostly, I just felt clean, like something that had been clinging to my skin for years had finally slid off. I turned to the waiter who stood awkwardly by the wall, watching the slow-motion implosion of a once impenetrable family. "We'll take dessert to go," I said. "Just one box." The man nodded, hurrying away. Camille didn't speak again. Neither did Raymond. No one moved. I walked toward the door, adjusting my cuffs, letting the quiet behind me fill in the space I'd once tried so hard to be welcome in. But I wasn't their shadow anymore. I wasn't the afterthought. I was the man who flipped the table they built on disrespect. And now I was walking away, not from the family, but from the need for their approval. I had already won. Camille smirked again, leaning back like she still had cards to play, like I hadn't just cleared the table in front of everyone she had ever used to prop up her ego. "You wouldn't dare," she said, her voice curling around the edges of arrogance. "My family built that company." It was the kind of line she thought would land like a threat. The kind she'd rehearsed in mirrors or whispered to Elise late at night while sipping wine and fantasizing about a world where I was always 2 steps behind her. But she didn't realize something crucial. This wasn't her world anymore. That company wasn't hers. That family name didn't weigh what it once did. The legacy she was clinging to like a velvet curtain had already been pulled down, folded, and repurposed into a banner with my name stitched across the front. I leaned in just slightly, just enough to meet her eyes head on. "And I rebuilt it while you were busy planning a dramatic dinner speech," I said calmly. "You blindsided me with divorce," I answered with a legacy rewrite. Her face didn't fall all at once. It cracked in places. Around the corners of her mouth, in the tight pull of her jaw, in the shift of her pupils as she tried to decide whether to argue or pivot. Her smirk died quietly, without ceremony. The same smirk that once got her into rooms, turned conflicts into jokes, made people forgive her manipulations. But now it faltered under something it had never faced before: accountability. Around the table, it was like someone had turned the volume down on their very identities. Elise didn't even pretend to be above it anymore. Her wineglass trembled in her hand, a soft clink as the stem tapped porcelain. Raymond stared at a point beyond me, past the chandelier, past the present, like he was watching the architecture of his pride collapse in slow motion. Lena was the only one still holding out for civility, her eyes wet with something between disbelief and regret, though I couldn't tell who she pitted more, me, Camille, or herself. Her brother Mark, who had arrived late and mostly silent up until now, finally spoke. "No way," he muttered, shaking his head. "There's no way this is real." "Oh, it's real," I said, turning slightly toward him. "Your family treated me like furniture for years. I was expected to be agreeable, invisible, grateful. You all made me feel like a guest at a table I paid for. And I stayed silent. Until now." Mark looked at Raymond, then Camille, then back at me. "So you're what, CEO now?" "Next month," I confirmed. "But the decisions are already mine to make. The damage, as they say, is done." Camille finally found her voice again, though it came out cracked and strained. "You won't get away with this. The board will fight you." "My father, the board," I interrupted, "is already dissolved. Legally, executed and verified. And your father has no more voting power. He signed it away, remember?" Raymond winced, jaw tight. "And the rest of your family?" I continued. "They'll be too busy turning on each other to worry about me." Camille's shoulders fell slightly, a twitch in her right hand betraying the calm she tried to project. "You don't have it in you to lead. You're not ruthless enough." "I don't need to be ruthless," I replied. "I just need to be better than you. And, Camille, that bar's been buried underground for years." The smirk didn't return this time. She didn't argue. Not really. I could see it now. The realization that this wasn't something she could charm or cry or bully her way out of. The power was gone. The mirrors were broken. The audience had stopped clapping. "This wasn't about revenge," I said, keeping my voice level. "If it were, I would have done this with cameras and press releases. But I didn't. I did it with lawyers and contracts. With time. With silence. And I did it clean." Lena looked like she wanted to speak, but nothing made it past the tight line of her lips. The weight of it was sinking in now, finally, as if every course of this meal had been laced with reality. Cold. Bitter. Earned. Camille looked at me like she was seeing something unfamiliar. Maybe it was the confidence, the clarity, the lack of apology. Maybe it was the fact that I wasn't begging. I wasn't breaking. I wasn't staying in the box she had drawn for me years ago. You always said you wanted a man who could take charge, I said, standing slowly, buttoning my jacket. You just didn't think it'd look like this. She laughed, sharp and humorless, but even that rang hollow. You think this makes you powerful? You think this makes you enough? No, I said, calmly. This makes me free. That was what this had always been about. Not domination. Not revenge. Just freedom from their games, their rules, their quiet wars fought behind perfectly arranged dinners. I wasn't interested in winning their respect anymore. I had built something larger than their approval could contain, and I had done it while they dismissed me as decoration. I placed my napkin on the table. You don't have to believe me now. You'll feel it soon enough. Every time a decision is made without you, every time the company you used to brag about sends out an email with my name in the signature. Camille didn't respond. Her silence was louder than her voice had ever been. Her face didn't hold rage anymore. Just a deep, stinging confusion, as though someone had stolen the last bit of her reflection from the mirror and replaced it with consequence. I walked to the door without looking back. The silence followed, heavier now. No applause, no vindication, just the truth, finally louder than their denial. I paused only once, at the entrance to the suite, turning back just long enough to say one final thing. Next time you plan a grand announcement, I said, make sure you know who's writing the next chapter. Then I walked out, leaving behind the table I had paid for, the family that never saw me coming, and a room that had just watched a dynasty shift in real time. No one spoke. Not a word. Not a whisper. Not a breath heavy enough to stir the linen napkins or rattle the stemware. The silence after detonation is never loud. It's suffocating, still, a kind of quiet that feels almost holy. That's what I walked back into when I returned to my seat for one last moment of composure. The private suite at Aurelio's, once filled with smug laughter and backhanded compliments, now sat in stunned reverence. Like a chapel after confession, Raymond stared at the space in front of him, no longer pretending he could salvage anything. Lena fidgeted with her ring, spinning it on her finger with the desperate repetition of someone trying to anchor herself. Elise checked her phone, then set it down, as if no message could save this moment. Even Mark, whose entire contribution to the evening had been awkward shrugs and passing the breadbasket, looked like he'd swallowed a power line. But Camille, that was the silence I noticed most. She sat with her hands in her lap, the heels of her shoes no longer clicking against the floor, no smirk painted across her face like armor. Her shoulders, always squared like a trophy wife preparing for a photo, had slumped. Not dramatically, just enough to say she knew. The war she'd started with a single wineglass tap had ended before the souffle even arrived. And the man she tried to humiliate in front of her family had buried the old version of himself under their feet. Her mother finally broke first. You planned this," Lena whispered, voice barely audible over the soft jazz playing somewhere in the distance. The playlist hadn't stopped, hadn't gotten the memo that a family implosion was underway. The music felt surreal now, like it belonged in another life, a different dinner, one where I still asked for permission to speak. I met Lena's gaze without hostility. "Yes," I said, down to the last course. Her face twisted slightly, like she didn't know whether to admire the strategy or cry over the fallout. Elise scoffed, more out of reflex than comprehension. She didn't understand the intricacies, the boardroom shifts, the subtle ways I'd dismantled their legacy one legal clause at a time. But she knew power when she saw it, and she knew Camille didn't have it anymore. I stood again, not to gloat, not to posture, but because I didn't need to sit at their table anymore. That chair was never meant for me. Not really. It had always been borrowed. Now, it was irrelevant. Camille's voice came next, barely. "You used me." I turned toward her slowly. "No," I said. "I stood beside you longer than I should have. I stayed quiet through things no husband should accept. I kept building while you kept dismissing. And even then, I didn't pull the trigger until you did." She blinked, slowly. "This is your idea of revenge." "No," I replied. "This is my idea of restoration. I just stopped trying to earn respect from people who didn't know what it looked like." Camille inhaled, like she was going to spit something venomous, but stopped herself. There was nothing left. I'd taken the one thing they thought untouchable, their power, and I didn't take it with noise or scandal or blood. I took it with ink and leverage and silence. The same silence they had used to erase me for years. I just made it louder. Raymond finally stood, albeit slowly. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the back of his chair. "You don't belong at the helm," he said, voice raspy. "You're not built for this world." "I built it," I replied without missing a beat. "While you were busy polishing your name, I was cleaning your mess. And the only reason I'm not more vindictive is because I know the company deserves better than either of us." That stopped him. Not because he believed it, but because he knew deep down it was true. Camille looked around the table now like she was seeing it for the first time. Like the throne she tried to protect had melted into quicksand beneath her. I saw something flicker across her face. Maybe fear, maybe awe, maybe both. And I didn't enjoy it. I didn't hate her. I just didn't need her anymore. I raised my glass, still half full from the toast that never was, and let it hover in the air. "To fresh starts," I said quietly, "and reading contracts before you sign them." No one clinked glasses. No one echoed the sentiment. And that was fine. That toast wasn't for them. It was for me. For the man I had to become to sit through years of quiet humiliation. For the silence I'd turned into strategy. For every slight they thought I didn't notice. Every insult dressed as wit. Every eye roll behind my back. I set the glass down without drinking. Camille stood, finally, slowly. She didn't say anything. Her hand reached for her purse, the one I bought for her birthday last year. The birthday she almost forgot. She took a shaky breath, then nodded once toward her mother, her sister, her father. Then she walked to the door without turning back. I let her go. I didn't stop her. I didn't need her acknowledgement. That chapter was closed. Elise followed a moment later, heels clicking like a typewriter punctuating an unfinished story. Raymond stayed seated, his eyes on the table, his thoughts chasing a million possible ways this could have gone differently. But it hadn't. It had gone exactly like this. The server returned with a delicate smile. "Dessert, sir." I looked at the untouched cake slices on the tray and gave a small nod. "Box it, please." He nodded and left quickly. As I stood once more and took one last look around the table, I realized something deeper than satisfaction had settled in me. Peace. Not triumph. Not smugness. Peace. Because I didn't need to shout to win. I just needed to be right. And patient. And prepared. The next time they sat at a table like this, someone else would be footing the bill. Someone else would try to wear the mask of control. But they'd always remember this night. The night the quiet man spoke last and loudest. And when the door shut behind me, I didn't just leave Aurelos. I left behind the man who once begged to be heard. The aftermath wasn't loud. It didn't come with dramatic phone calls or teary confrontations or Camille showing up at my door screaming about betrayal. No. The real fallout was quiet. Cold. Administrative. It came in the form of emails timestamped at odd hours. Per your request, the onboarding documents are attached, or please confirm the final transition date. It came through resignation letters forwarded to my private inbox with terse subject lines like "effective immediately" and "regretfully submitted." No emotion. Just paperwork. Signatures. The kind of silence that meant the Empire had heard the thunder and now moved under new weather. Camille served me the divorce papers 3 days after the dinner. Delivered by a courier. I didn't flinch when I opened them. I'd expected it. What I didn't expect was the clause about alimony, lifetime support. Her lawyer must have thought I'd panic. Thought I'd want to avoid dragging our names through court. But I sent the packet back within the hour. Same courier. Different annotations. No alimony. No settlement. No shared assets. I crossed out lines with red ink and signed my name with finality. Let her respond to that. She did. Her next letter came with more demands and a brief handwritten note in the margin. "You're not going to win everything." I didn't respond in words. I just had my lawyer file a motion with attached financial records, our prenup, her inheritance, my business portfolio. Every angle covered. Every gap closed. She tried to bluff again the following week, insinuating that my recent acquisition might have violated non-compete clauses or insider trading rules. But I'd already had 3 compliance teams vet the entire process. I'd been too careful, too quiet, too patient. And by the time her attorney realized that, the judge had already dismissed her motion. The real unraveling happened inside her own family. Raymond called for an emergency shareholder meeting 4 days after our dinner. I didn't attend. There was no point. I already held the votes. The room filled with his loyalists, the ones who used to nod at him like he was a king, and then half of them realized I now controlled the throne. They left with their heads down. Some sent emails later that night. Some just disappeared. Lena tried reaching out once. A polite message on a Sunday morning. I'd like to understand your intentions if you're open to a conversation. I read it, closed the app, and never replied. She hadn't said a word to defend me in all those years. She didn't get to ask for clarity now. And Elise? She did what she always did when her world shook, posted vague, curated photos of herself on vacation. Palm trees and mocktails and carefully chosen captions like healing isn't linear. The comments were filled with empty heart emojis. She hadn't even told her followers that her family just lost their business. Of course she hadn't. She was always better at filtering the truth. Meanwhile, I kept working. The first thing I did as interim CEO was restructure the executive team. I removed anyone who'd benefited from nepotism or stagnation. No more coasting. No more last names as credentials. I met with each department personally, asked questions, listened. Some of them were surprised I showed up. Others were relieved. I think a few even expected me to be some cold-blooded vengeance machine in a tailored suit. But I didn't lead that way. I didn't need to. I offered contracts based on performance. I rehired a few people Raymond had quietly pushed out over the years because they asked too many questions. I launched a transparent audit of the company's operations and posted the results to our internal network. No fluff, no spin, just facts. Profits were climbing again. People weren't scared. They were hopeful. It was a strange feeling, being respected without having to demand it. But I didn't let it intoxicate me. I just kept showing up. Steady. Direct. Unshaken. Camille sent one final letter near the end of the second month. This time, it wasn't through her lawyer. It was handwritten. 2 pages. No demands. Just words. She wrote that she never expected to lose everything in one night. That when she announced our divorce at dinner, she thought I'd walk out humiliated. That it wasn't about hate. It was about theater. Image. Control. She thought that if she delivered the first blow, she could own the narrative. She admitted that, in some twisted way, she had always known I was smarter than I let on, but she'd gotten used to ignoring that truth, because it made her feel safer to believe I needed her more than she needed me. She ended with a single sentence. I guess I didn't realize the silence meant you were listening. I folded the letter and placed it in a box in my study. I didn't write back. The old board was gone. The company was rebuilding. Camille and I were legally separated. Her father's name was no longer on the executive directory. Elise was rumored to be applying for positions in PR firms where her last name didn't earn her interviews. The entire family, once united by entitlement, had turned on each other, fracturing into silence and self-preservation. And me? I was doing what I always did. Working, creating, planning. Not for revenge, not for applause, but for peace. There was no dramatic closing scene, no burning bridges. Just clean exits, signed papers, and new beginnings. Camille once told me that silence was weakness, but now she knew. Silence is preparation. Silence is power. Silence is the sound of someone building a better future while everyone else is busy performing. And mine had just begun. 3 months later, I stood at the top floor of the Dufresne building, the corner office once occupied by Raymond now repurposed with glass shelves, clean light, and silence that didn't judge. It was late morning, and the city skyline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows like a portrait of every obstacle I'd climbed over. The desk was mine now, sleek, organized, without the clutter of false prestige. No family photographs, no bronze plaques praising a man who barked orders while others did the real work. Just a frame quote I kept for myself. Power is quiet until it speaks. And mine had finally spoken. I ran my hand across the edge of the desk, not for drama but for grounding. This space wasn't just a promotion. It wasn't revenge. It was proof. Proof that I had been underestimated for too long. Proof that I didn't need their last name to matter. Proof that the man they laughed at from the other end of a dinner table now held the keys to what they called legacy. The office had changed. Not just in layout, but in energy. No more flunkies coming in to nod along to Raymond's speeches. No more entitled executives punching the clock on nepotism. The new leadership team was lean, skilled, and brutal in the best way. Analysts who'd spent years buried in middle management now had seats in executive strategy meetings. Creative minds with no pedigree were finally listened to. Promotions were earned, not inherited. And with every decision, respect echoed down the halls. I wasn't feared. I was followed. That distinction mattered to me. I walked the halls regularly. No scheduled tours. No handlers announcing my arrival. I'd grab a coffee from the break room, nod at interns, ask questions in the middle of open workspaces. At first, they'd glance over nervously, waiting for some corporate pretense to drop. But I kept showing up, and soon, they started treating me like someone who was real. One of them, employees who once whispered when I passed, now greeted me by name. A few even stopped me to say things I hadn't expected. "Thank you for fixing things," or "We actually feel heard now." Those were the things I carried with me, more than the corner office or the title. This company wasn't afraid of me. It was finally alive under me. Camille hadn't been seen since the divorce was finalized. No farewell parties. No office goodbyes. She hadn't stepped foot into the building since the dinner at Aurelo's. Her access badge had been deactivated quietly, with no ceremony. A few of her former assistants had reached out to me nervously, worried their loyalty might cost them their jobs. But I kept everyone who showed up to work with integrity. Her shadow didn't extend that far anymore. Raymond, for his part, had gone quiet. After the board was dissolved and the public learned of the internal restructuring, he issued one statement to the press, something vague about stepping back to allow for new vision. But everyone knew. You could hear it in the tone of the journalists, the way they hesitated before quoting him. Dufresne wasn't his story anymore. It was mine. I hadn't spoken to him since that night. There was nothing left to say. I imagined he was nursing his wounded pride somewhere, swearing he'd rebuild or rebrand or launch something new. But I also knew he didn't have it in him. Not anymore. His power came from inherited altitude. Mine came from the climb. The week before, I had addressed the entire company in our first internal town hall. No suit, no podium, just me in a button-down, sleeves rolled, standing at the front of the multi-floor atrium like I was leading a team meeting, not a regime change. I told them everything, where we were going, how we'd get there, and who'd be coming with us. I didn't use vague corporate speak or flashy charts. I just spoke. From experience. From conviction. And when I finished, the applause wasn't thunderous. It was solid. Earned. That's when I knew we were no longer surviving. We were growing. The view from the top wasn't made of marble or gold. It was made of choices. Every one of them carved from moments they thought didn't matter. When Raymond refused to listen. When Camille made snide comments. When they all assumed I'd stay small just because I stayed quiet. They thought power looked like shouting in boardrooms and tossing around surnames like weapons. But real power was sitting in a quiet office, knowing you could have crushed them, and choosing instead to build something better. There were moments I missed the version of me before all this. The man who brought Camille coffee before her long meetings. The man who stayed late fixing spreadsheets no one would thank him for. That man was gone. But he wasn't wasted. He was the foundation. And every misstep, every humiliation, had turned into leverage. My assistant. Real assistant, not one inherited from old loyalties, buzzed through the intercom. "You have that 11:30 call with the European division in 10 minutes, sir." "Thanks, Jordan," I said. On my way. I grabbed the folder from the desk, but before walking out, I paused at the glass wall one more time. Below, the city pulsed with movement. A reminder that every empire looks steady from above, until it's not. I didn't want to build an empire. I wanted to build a company worth staying in. As I stepped into the hallway, passing the open offices where teams were actually working, collaborating, not just posturing, I felt something deeper than pride. I felt belonging. It wasn't flashy. It didn't demand to be seen. But it was real. And it had taken me years to find. Camille had once told me I'd never be the kind of man people respected. That I was too soft-spoken, too cautious. But what she didn't understand was that caution wasn't weakness. It was strategy. I wasn't afraid. I was calculating, watching, waiting. And when the time came, I didn't react. I executed. The version of me that once sat in the back of the room now led it. The man they laughed off now carried their legacy in a direction they could never have imagined. And in all of it, in the silence that followed the storm, in the applause from a team that finally believed in leadership, in the measured weight of power that didn't need to shout, I found something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not because everything had gone right, but because I'd stopped waiting for permission to matter. Because I knew who I was. Because I knew exactly what I'd built. And finally, because I knew they'd never see the top floor the way I did. Not ever again. The next annual shareholder dinner didn't look like the ones before it. Gone were the velvet-draped centerpieces, the pretentious imported wines that Camille insisted on each year, the smug after-dinner speeches Raymond delivered like sermons. This time, the event was leaner, cleaner, more intentional. The guest list had been trimmed to people who contributed, not just those who coasted. The dining hall wasn't a five-star museum of excess. It was a modern rooftop venue with soft jazz in the background and a skyline that didn't need embellishment. No showy nameplates. No forced applause. Just the people who helped build what came after the fall. I arrived a little early. Not for the optics, but because I wanted to take it in first. This moment that once lived only in daydreams when I was ignored at family gatherings or condescended to in boardrooms. Now it was real, tangible, and quiet in the best way. No Camille. No Raymond. No Elise. Their absence wasn't announced. It wasn't dramatic. It was just complete. A vacuum of noise that no one missed. A few old investors whispered about it, curious about what had happened, wondering how the empire turned. But most of the room already knew. They had seen the shift. They'd read the statements, watched the headlines, felt the difference in their dividends. I hadn't needed to destroy the old guard. I'd simply made them obsolete. As people filtered in, I shook hands, nodded at familiar faces. New department heads, international partners, even a few employees who'd risen through the ranks over the past 6 months. Their eyes didn't carry fear. They carried trust. And when they asked how my family was, it wasn't just small talk. They meant it. That mattered more than they knew. I stood near the edge of the rooftop, watching the last glow of sunset reflect off the city's glass towers when my assistant approached and said, "They're ready for you." I walked to the center of the space, where a minimalist podium stood beneath soft lighting. A mic was clipped to the collar of my jacket, but I didn't need it. The room quieted before I said a word. I let the silence stretch, just a few seconds longer than expected. Then I raised my glass. To clean slates. I began, my voice even, measured, steady, to smart moves, and to not underestimating the man sitting quietly at the end of the table. A few people chuckled. Others nodded. Every single person knew exactly what that line meant. When I joined this family by marriage, I continued, I was offered a seat, but not a voice. For years, I was told what I wasn't. Not sharp enough. Not commanding enough. Not part of the bloodline. I smiled. I stayed quiet. And I listened. Because I knew silence had its own power. I paused, letting my words settle. They taught me that legacy is about control. But I've learned that legacy is actually about value. Contribution. Accountability. And everyone in this room has proven what happens when value is honored over vanity. There was a light, appreciative murmur. I didn't get here by shouting. I got here by building. By listening to the people who were ignored. By reading every contract they skimmed and preparing for every moment they laughed off. And when the time came, I didn't react. I stepped forward. I looked out across the faces in the crowd. Diverse, engaged, sharper than the rooms I'd once been dismissed in. Dufresne Group is no longer a monument to one family's name. It's a living, breathing company with momentum and purpose. Our success will not be determined by who your parents are, but by the integrity of your work. That's the shift. That's the promise. I raised my glass again. To everyone who rebuilt this with me. To those who chose merit over memory. And to the future, we're ready. This time, the room toasted with me. Not out of obligation. Not because they feared the fallout of refusing, but because they believed in the table we'd rebuilt together. After the speech, people didn't rush to leave. They lingered. They spoke freely. They asked questions, gave feedback, shared stories. The company felt more human now. Less dynasty, more team. As I stood off to the side, sipping a final glass of wine, I caught a glimpse of the old skyline again. It looked different now. Not smaller, but less intimidating. Like it had finally made room for someone like me. Camille hadn't sent anything. No letter, no message, no final word. And that, in a way, was her last performance. Vanishing before the lights came up on someone else's stage. I didn't need her apology. I didn't need her presence. I had everything I'd earned. And as the laughter from my team filled the rooftop and the city lights flickered to life around us, I felt something settle in my chest. Something clear. Strong. Peace. The kind you don't have to announce. The kind that comes when you've stopped waiting to be seen and started building something they can't ignore. I turned toward the crowd again, and this time, I didn't feel like the outsider watching through the glass. I was exactly where I belonged, at the head of the table. And this time, the room knew it too.